So as one example, I'd like to talk to you guys about the salmonella and peanut butter outbreak that occurred in 2008 to 2009. And there's a bunch of reasons why this is a really important outbreak. And so I'd like to highlight what exactly happened, but also explain why it was particularly important, kind of from the history of outbreaks in the US. So this is an overflow kind of flow diagram of the peanut butter processing chain of steps. And in peanut butter, or at the components of peanut butter include peanut, salt, vegetable oil, corn syrup, and dextrose or sugar. And the first major step is the shelling of the peanuts. And then they go into a dry roasting process, which is mandated to be 160 degrees centigrade for 40 to 60 minutes. The peanuts are then cooled. They're dry blanched to remove the skin. That's an additional heating step at 138 for 25 minutes. Then they're ground and mixed, also with a more moderate heating step, and packaged into in general, the jars that we're used to receiving in the grocery store. Now, sometimes they're bigger jars, sometimes they're smaller jars. So I think one of the important things to realize is there's a ton of heating steps here, right? Okay, so in general, one would anticipate that salmonella would be inactivated pretty readily with these pretty extensive heating steps. There's also a lot of process controls that are involved. So there certainly are supply chain controls that have to do with monitoring the growing conditions of the peanuts, making sure the moisture is low, that there's no conditions that are conducive for salmonella to actually be present in the raw material, in the raw nuts. There certainly is process control. Largely that falls in the realm of temperature control for each of the processing steps. That then includes, as we saw in the previous slide, dry roasting, dry blanching, and grinding. And there's lots of sanitation controls. One of the things you want to do is prevent contamination during packaging. Certainly preventing cross-contamination during the entire process, and assuring that the storage conditions of the raw peanuts are such that you are not in a situation where you have raw peanuts ingredients that are actually of high quality, but they end up getting contaminated with a pathogen at the plant while they're being stored prior to processing. So let's revisit our intrinsic and extrinsic parameters a little bit and talk about what might impact salmonella growth. Well, clearly the extrinsic parameter of temperature during storage is really important in terms of potentially preventing growth. Now, keep in mind, some people store their peanut butter in the refrigerator, but in point of fact, it is considered a shelf-stable product, and it is accepted as a shelf-stable product. So peanut butter, as long as it's not temperature abused, is going to be stored at room temperature. Intrinsic factors, well, peanut butter has an incredibly low water activity, but at the same time, it has high pH, or well, elevated pH, certainly a pH that is not going to be too conducive to suppressing growth, and tons of nutrients for microbes. But when you look at a pH, a water activity of about 0.35, that's pretty low. One would not expect a bacterium to grow in such a low water activity. And then, of course, there's always the human handling aspect, which we just talked about, whether product would be stored in the refrigerator after opening. But again, it is largely considered a shelf-stable product. So this was happened in the outbreak. There was an unusual cluster of cases that occurred actually in multiple states. And using pulse field gel electrophoresis patterns, the PFGE patterns that are part of the the program that CDC uses to track potential outbreaks, they were able to identify the same serotype with the same PFGE pattern shared amongst those patients. So that's pretty much your smoking gun that there is a common source causing this outbreak. 86% of the patients had eaten chicken, 77 had eaten peanut butter. What they found in the epidemiological investigation was an odds ratio of about 2.5. If you recall from the introductory slide, that means the odds of exposure to peanut butter in the cases was 2.5 times higher than the odds of exposure to peanut butter in the controls. It turns out that Peanut Corporation of America, which is a very, very large processor, sold peanut butter in bulk to many, many, many different companies, institutions, food service. They co-packed under a variety of different brands. And they also sold it as an ingredient. So they were an enormous processor in the United States. By the time the outbreak was over, a total of 116 patients had been hospitalized, and there were potentially 8 deaths. So when did it start? It started on November 10th, went through March 17th at the sort of the end when the response finally happened. You can see here the timeline of how it was actually, the first cluster was identified, then the second cluster was identified. Finally, within 2 months, a recall was issued for one brand, and then a little bit after that, Peanut Corporation of America was actually implicated, and more product was recalled. This was, you guys probably don't remember this, but this was a massive outbreak in the US. And keep in mind that peanut butter is a product that's eaten by a lot of different people, including a critical part of the school lunch program. So when FDA and CDC went into the plant, which is part of your outbreak investigation, is a full investigation of what happened to cause this, they found a lot of different infractions. So they found unsanitary storage conditions, including rain and other water that could enter the storage area that was used for roasting the peanuts. So that can serve as a source of contamination, in this case, salmonella. They found rodent accessible entryways. Again, rodents are well known for carrying salmonella, and unsealed air. They also saw cross-contamination situation such that raw and roasted peanuts came into contact with one another. So the idea there is there probably were some contaminated raw peanuts that came into contact with peanuts that had already gone through the roasting process. So that is cross-contamination. But the real kicker was inadequate processing. It was uncertain that the peanut roaster had reached the appropriate temperatures consistently. So in particular, the process control failures are highlighted in red here, and they really summarize the previous slide. And these were then what we're focused on in terms of investigating the most important components that contributed to this outbreak occurring. The government response was pretty aggressive. Both FDA and the Georgia Department of Agriculture went in and did a thorough investigation in the processing facility. Companies that had purchased from Peanut Company of America initiated voluntary recalls on their products, as well as the processor themselves issuing recalls on its products. As is the case for many, many, many outbreaks, a number of civil suits were filed against Peanut Corporation of America, and there was significant amount of reporting and actually investigation outside of epidemiological investigation that was done on the topic of how this could have happened. It was very clear when they got into the investigation more in depth, particularly I think with some media associations or some media investigation, that the company had known for a long time, years, that it had a salmonella problem. And they had kind of ignored it. So not only had they not put their product on hold or destroyed potentially contaminated product, but they also had, when they identified the problem, they didn't do anything to try to ameliorate it. And so what ended up happening was this was the first time a company owner faced a life sentence for a food poisoning outbreak. And he actually received 28 years. And if you read Food Safety News or some of you might actually hear this in the press some, I believe there's some discussion about releasing him from prison, or he's recently been released from prison. But the bottom line is that he did face criminal charges and was convicted. Other employees were also sent to prison. That included the plant quality assurance manager, as well as the food broker, who was the owner's brother. And as you can see here, the problem was the owner knew, and he said, just ship it. This particular outbreak had something to do also with the Food Safety Modernization Act mandate that finally granted FDA mandatory recall authority. Before the Food Safety Modernization Act, which I believe was released in 2010, FDA could suggest recall of contaminated product, but they couldn't mandate it legally, and now they can. And it also was very important in moving more food processors to establish very stringent food safety plans. Sort of historically speaking, HACCP plans became mandated by FSIS regulated products. So that's meats and processed, any meat products and processed eggs back in '96. But FDA was a little bit later to the game in wanting or requiring their regulated processors to establish food safety plans or formal food safety plans. And that also became part of the Food Safety Modernization Act. And this particular outbreak was pivotal in that happening. So with that, here's a bunch of references if you're interested in reading details or commentaries on this particular outbreak. And we will move on to the next one.